Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, number 22 trillion should matter to us. 22 trillion. That's our current debt number in the United States. Now, not to be confused, we have debts and we have deficits. Deficit, you'll hear sometimes those names get thrown around together, but deficit is the amount of single-year overspending in a year. 1 year overspending. Debt is the collection of all of those deficits. Our current debt, $22 trillion as a nation. Give you a perspective on 22 trillion. If you were to take 22 trillion miles, just total distance, 22 trillion miles, you would fly from Earth to Pluto and back 3,081 times. From Earth to Pluto and back 3,081 times to get to 22 trillion miles. This is a heavy debt. We're used to hearing about debt and deficits in relationship to like a mortgage, a home mortgage. Many of us think about paying off our mortgage and spending 30 years to be able to pay off a mortgage. Well, our national mortgage, this $22 trillion that we have, that national mortgage, for us to be able to pay it off, if we were to balance our budget, which we're way out of balance right now, but if we were to balance our budget and then have a $100 billion surplus, so let's just say by next year we're balanced $100 billion surplus. That'd be a very large surplus for us. If we had a $100 billion surplus, how many years would it take of a $100 billion surplus in total revenue to be able to pay off 22 trillion? The quick math of that is 220 years. Approximately as long as we have been a republic, if we did that every single year for the next 220 years, had a $100 billion surplus, we could pay off our mortgage. Does anyone think for the next 220 years, every single year, we're going to both balance our budget and have a $100 billion surplus? The issues that we face as a nation is we've fumbled a lot of our past. We fumbled our spending. We fumbled how we've handled federal tax dollars. And we've got to be able to work our way out of this. But climbing out of this is not going to be a one-year deal. This is not a short-term fix. This is an intentional long-term fix. The two things you have to have economic growth. If our economy is stagnant, you never catch up. The reason for that is when the economy is stagnant, more people in our nation need assistance. They need housing support. They need food support. They need other things to be able to help them in those scarce times. Unemployment benefits go up significantly during that time period when our economy is down because people can't find a job and our safety net kicks in larger amounts. When you have economic growth that happens, fewer people need housing assistance, fewer people need food assistance, fewer people are on unemployment benefits. And the economy grows itself. As more people have a job and make money, more people are paying taxes. So economic growth is essential to the growth of our economy and for us working out of our debt. That's why the tax reform bill was so incredibly important to us, to get a growing economy again. Our economy had been stagnant for a decade. We would literally never get out of it if we stayed in a stagnant economy. Now, I've heard folks that have caught me and said, well, you know what? When the tax revenue changed, when that bill happened in the tax reform, it also blew a hole in the budget. And I've had folks throw all kinds of numbers around and say, this is the giant hole that's in the budget. Interestingly enough, we're now a fiscal year through. Our revenue for fiscal year 2017, the year before the tax reform, was $3,315 billion. Our revenue after the tax cut and the tax reform for fiscal year 2018, $3,329 billion. If you're doing the math in your head, that's $14 billion more after the tax cuts in revenue. It means our revenue went up the next year. Contrary to all the myths that were out there early on to say we're going to have this giant hole in the budget, our revenue went up after the tax cuts went into place. Why? More people had more money to invest. More people invested. As they invested, as they engaged in the economy, as they had more money in their pocket, they bought more products. That stimulated more profits. That means that people got paid more. What has happened in our economy in the past year? Wages have gone up, especially wages on the lowest income Americans. Their wages have gone up. Unemployment has come down. More people have a job. More opportunities to be able to get a different job. All those things are of great benefit. But that doesn't solve $22 trillion in debt. We have to have economic growth, but economic growth by itself is never going to solve the issue. We also have to deal with our spending and our plans. Each year, for the last 4 years, my office has released something we call federal fumbles. It's ways that we believe the federal government has dropped the ball. And each year we take different areas. Over the last 4 years, we've identified over $800 billion in ways that we could save the federal tax dollars. In specific problems that we laid out the problem, here's the solution. If we want to try to start attacking some of these things, here's a proposal. Our goal from our office is very simple. We believe all 100 offices should be looking for ways to be able to save the federal tax dollars. We believe that everyone should look for ways that we can do efficiency. What we're doing is not unique only to our team. Every team can do it. And in fact, we believe that everyone wants to see the debt and deficit go down, but it's now the next step of actually identifying how to do it. We've identified in the last 4 years $800 billion of ways to be able to save federal tax dollars. That's a start. That's a beginning point of actually how to be able to get us there. That would get us back to balancing our budget, but we still have a ways to be able to go to get to a surplus and paying off our debt and deficit. This year, we've identified our federal fumble report and just released it out actually today online. People can go to anyone from any office, any place, can go to lankford.senate.gov and actually download the free report. This report's a little bit different for us. We want to identify what are the major problems that we have, not only in overspending and blowing our deficit, but we want to identify ways that we're actually being inefficient in how we operate. We begin with talking about government shutdowns, as I think we should begin with. We've just experienced the longest government shutdown in American history. It's not the first by far. People have short memories when they forget the government shutdowns that happened in the Carter administration, the 3 times that Tip O'Neill shut down the government on President Reagan in the 1980s, the multiple shutdowns that have occurred on almost every presidency in the modern day. But it's not solving the problems that we have. Last year, there were 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats that met for almost the entire year talking about how to reform the budget process. I'm a firm believer that we're never going to solve the problem of our budgeting until we solve the problem of how we do budgeting. We don't budget in a way that actually determines more efficient spending. We determine how to spend more, but not how to spend less. That's an issue we've got to solve. The 1974 Budget Act, that's only worked 4 times since it was written in 1974, is not gospel. It's not Constitution. It needs to be redone. And there are proposals that we put into place specifically on how we can fix the budgeting process. Because again, until we get a better budget product, we'll never get a better budget process, we'll never get a better budget product. So we identify just some simple things. How we can do a 2-year budgeting system, how we can avoid government shutdowns. There's some simple solutions we put into place that I think would actually be effective. We've released a bipartisan bill in the last couple of days on ending government shutdowns that I hope that we can actually get some momentum towards and actually solve the issue of government shutdowns. We deal with the issue of the president's budget, not just this president, every president's budget. It's been a problem. There's never been a time since the 1974 Budget Act that the president's budget has ever been implemented. It's an informational document. Let's turn it to what it should be. Let's figure out how we actually start reducing our deficit. We have 12 bills that we put out every single year for spending. There is no mandatory bill for savings. So as simple as this sounds, why don't we add a 13th bill to our appropriations process? 12 that are designed for spending and 1 that's designed for savings. That every time there would have to be a savings bill for every single Congress. Now that Congress could choose how much they want to save, but every single Congress would have a mandatory savings bill. to try to figure out what they're going to do to actually try to pull our deficits back. With $22 trillion in debt, I don't anticipate anytime soon we're not going to need that 13th bill. We could do this. We could fix the way that we actually make the law of the budget, which currently is not law. It's a suggestion made by Congress that's blown past every single year. There's all kinds of budget games that are out there that make the budget actually look better than what it is. Some of them are great, cute names like chimps, changes in mandatory programs. They sound adorable, but actually what they do is they make the budget look like it's closer to balance when it's actually even farther with a budget gimmick. We need to be able to end some of those. We lay out proposals for how to be able to do that. We even lay out proposals on how to deal with the debt ceiling, on how to be able to resolve that. Process reforms will make a big difference for us to get on top of the big issue. They may not be exciting, they may not be headline grabbing, but until we fix these things as a body, it's never going to get better. We deal with the Senate rules on how we're actually going to work together to be able to solve the issues. The Senate has stopped working together in a lot of these things. And so we lay out some of the internal aspects of how to be able to solve them. We lay out some bills that are out there that we propose, one called the Taxpayer's Right to Know. We don't have great transparency in our spending. If the taxpayer wanted to go find out how many government programs there were that were similar in function, they couldn't get it. The hard part is we can't get it as Congress either. The only way that we can get a programmatic list or to go through the details of the different programs from different agencies is to make a request of an entity called the GAO. Usually between 12 and 18 months later, they will give us a report back, just to say what programs are out there and what those programs do. I've met multiple times with the director of GAO with a bill proposal called the Taxpayer's Right to Know, a bill that passed the House of Representatives last session unanimously, and has come to the Senate installed. This bill does something very simple. It tells lawmakers and taxpayers what their government actually does. It's not trying to hide anything. It's trying to list every program that we do, how much we spend on that program, if it's evaluated, how it's evaluated, how many employees are dedicated to it. There's no gimmicks to it. It's just that simple. It's transparency. The great gift to our democracy is transparency in how we spend dollars. It would allow, just this basic bill, would allow every single person in the country to be able to ask questions of their government. Why do we have 4 programs that seem to do the same thing? Why do we have 18 programs in another area in 16 different entities that seem to do something similar? Why can't we combine that? Why can't we crowdsource ideas? The reason is we don't put transparent information out. We could crowdsource ideas of how to be able to fix our government if only we allowed the taxpayer to see their government. The Taxpayer's Right to Know allows us to do that. We deal with our grant reforms. It's one of the areas that we've pushed on pretty hard in the last several federal fumbles books. But we lay out a set of ideas. There's a bill called the GREAT Act, which passed in the last House of Representatives overwhelmingly. And by the way, this House of Representatives in this session, led by Democrats, has also passed the GREAT Act and has sent it over to us to be able to reform the grant process and how that information gets out. Now, it's a first step in getting information. I think there's more, but it's a great first step for that. Grants always seem to be our issue. $600 billion a year is spent by the federal government just on grants. $600 billion. There's a great need for greater transparency in that. Some grants are very large, some of them are small. Some of them we can't figure out at all why we do it as a federal taxpayer. For instance, last year, the National Endowment for Humanities did a grant to a California professor to use federal tax dollars to study Soviet winemaking. Not current Russian winemaking, historic Soviet winemaking with federal grant dollars. Now, I can kind of understand why California winemakers may want to be able to do a study of Soviet winemaking for some reason, but why is the federal taxpayer being asked to pay for a study on Soviet winemaking? but we did. Since 2001, we have a federal grant for a mariachi program in California. Now, I kind of understand how a successful mariachi program working with children and youth, maybe something we would do as a couple of years to get started as a community program makes total sense. But we've done it every year since 2001. At some point, shouldn't the local entities pick that up? Why is that a federal program that has to be done year after year after year? The grant issues don't have a lot of transparency, and there's a reason for that, because people don't want to be seen. They don't want to know that that program is out there. We want to just ask a simple question. Let's do the grants, but let's make sure they line up with federal priorities. Let's make sure they actually line up with strategic things that actually help our economy and help expand our nation or protect our national security. They're basic things that we can do. We lay some of those things out. We lay out some questions that we think are practical questions on the renewable fuel and on ethanol in particular. The ethanol program was designed to be able to reduce emissions. But when it was designed to reduce emissions, it also grandfathered in all of the entities that produced ethanol currently at that time, and none of those were required to reduce emissions. Only new ones. Well, what's happened? Practically no new ones have come on board because it's a lot more expensive to limit emissions than it is to be an old facility that doesn't limit emissions. So you can't be competitive limiting emissions. So it really, what the ethanol mandate does is protect the old ethanol companies to make sure they never get competition. Why aren't we as a Congress looking at that? You pay more at the gas pump every time you fill up if you're not in the Midwest because of the ethanol. Now, if you're in the Midwest, it may be a little cheaper for you. But if you're on the East or the West Coast, your gas prices are higher because of the ethanol mandate. Are you happy with that? We as a government need to be able to look at that. And we think it's a legitimate question to be able to ask about, not only on our debt and deficit, but just for basic consumer spending and for our GDP and the growth of our economy. We deal with a lot of issues on federal workforce. We deal with regulatory reform. We walk through some of the hardest issues about how we're taking care of our veterans and what's happening to be able to take care of things like health care and transitioning them into vocational work because we feel it's important. We dug into small programs. For instance, an IT development program for veterans in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Because if you're in the Veteran Service Center in Muskogee, they're one of the largest veteran service centers in the country. You handle a lot of different documents. And as you go through that process for those great employees that are there, and there's some really solid people that are there, they have to log in multiple times and use a whole list of workarounds in their system that bogs down. Each employee there spends 45 minutes a day just going through the logistics of logging in and changing around their system to make it work. 45 minutes a day of lost productivity in every single person there. Well, the good news is the Congress allocated $30 million to be able to fix their IT. It's still there. So we're asking the simple question, where'd that money go? How come the problem wasn't fixed? We can go on on these issues. We tried to lay out page after page sets of solutions, things that we see as problems and inefficiencies in the way our government is working, the way our Congress is working, and to be able to establish what can be done. Our goal is simple. Laying out federal funds is a to-do list for us. This is what we're working on right now, along with a lot of other issues. And we encourage every office to be able to glance through it. Ask your staff to be able to glance through and see the things that they're working on in their office and see if we're not laying out some ideas. And let's find ways to work together. Of all things that we can do that we should be able to agree on, we should be able to agree $22 trillion in debt needs to be addressed. So let's strategize how we're going to solve it. Let's find ways that our government's inefficient, and let's find ways to be able to fix it. Let me give you one more number. We met in a bipartisan group last year, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats, trying to solve this issue on budgeting, unfortunately unsuccessfully. But the Congressional Budget Office came and visited with us, and we asked them a very specific question. Our current level of debt, if we were to just try to stay at our current level of debt, not grow anymore, not get any worse, our current level of debt, how much would we have to tax or cut to be able to stay at our current level of debt? Their response was $400 billion a year, every year for the next 30 years. To just not make the problem worse, we have to either tax more or cut $400 billion a year, every year, for the next 30 years to keep it from getting worse. That's because, as CBO stated, federal outlays, that's how much we're spending, are projected to climb from 20.8% of GDP in 2019 to 23% by 2029. The aging of the population, the rising healthcare costs contribute significantly to the growth of spending for the major benefit programs such as Social Security and Medicare, and the rising debt and higher interest rates drive up the federal government's net interest cost. We've reached a tipping point in interest. Our interest payments last year, $325 billion just in interest on our debt. CBO estimates within 10 years, our interest payments alone will be $928 billion. We've crossed over that tipping point we talked about before. Now, just to stay status quo because of the rising interest rates and interest payments, we have to find $400 billion a year, every year, in new taxes or new cuts just to stay where we are. We're fumbling the biggest issue that the Americans have handed us. It affects our national security. It affects the future for our children. It affects how we take care of those that are in poverty. It affects those that are in their most vulnerable moments of life. It affects those in disability. It affects our transportation. We have got to have real dialogue about this. We're doing our part. We're trying to get the word out. Let's have dialogue to try to figure out what we can do next together to be able to solve this. Because none of us have plans for a $400 billion cut next year. So that means next year it gets worse again. And it will keep going until we solve it. With that, I yield the floor.